It's my honor to introduce Lisa Genova, a neuroscientist by training who graduated valedictorian from Bates College with a bachelor's in biophysiology. Biopsychology. You can tell I didn't go for that, huh? And received a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University in 1998. She's done research at Massachusetts General Hospital, Yale Medical School, McLean Hospital, and the National Institutes for Health. More recently, Lisa has been lauded for her work as the author of the New York Times best-selling novels Still Alice, Left Neglected, Love Anthony, and Inside the O'Briens. All works that cover patients and families living with neurological disorders. For those of you who have read any of Lisa's work, you know the stories are sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes heartwarming, but always, always true to the patient communities that she is seeking to reflect. Very important to note, Lisa is one of our own. She lives and works right here in Massachusetts. We are thrilled to have her joining us here today. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Genova to the stage.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. And a shout out to Rob Goldstein at ALS-TDI for hooking me up with the MassBio Summit and inviting me here to talk. This is a really special opportunity for me to share some of my journey with you in the hopes that maybe, so this is not my typical talk. I talk a lot about Alzheimer's or autism or Huntington's, but today, in thinking about what I want to give to you, I'm hoping to maybe add to some of the inspiration that I think you've already been experiencing throughout this day. So you heard some of my bio. I should be working at Novartis or ALS-TDI or any number of biotechs that you all probably work at or represent in the lab with a white lab coat at a bench with rats and mice and DNA and RNA. And I don't do any of that anymore. I write fiction. And that's a really, really bizarre career change for a neuroscientist. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that happened. So my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the late 90s, and I'm from a large Italian family, and caregiving did not fall on my shoulders. I'm one of the youngest grandchildren of close to 30 grandkids. And yet I'm a neuroscientist. She has Alzheimer's. I'm going to go learn everything I can learn about this disease and help educate my family who's taking care of her. And also just myself. I want to understand what she has so I can stay better connected to her as she goes through this. And so I read the scientific literature and I learned a lot about amyloid beta and glutamate and neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques. Didn't really help my cause. I learned a lot about caregiving through books like The 36-Hour Day. I read the clinical texts, and so I had a very strong clinical picture of what Alzheimer's was like. And so I understood it intellectually with my mind, but I wasn't really understanding it with my heart. So I could understand it as a neuroscientist or a caregiver, but not as a granddaughter. And what I noticed was missing from all of the literature that I was reading was the point of view of the patient. So everything I read about Alzheimer's was written by a scientist, a clinician, a caregiver, a social worker, a leader of a caregiver support group. But it was missing that point of view, that perspective of what it feels like from the person who has it. And that was really the seed for me of wanting to write Still Alice. It was, I'd like to tell a story. And it's interesting, why write fiction as opposed to nonfiction? Well, fiction is a place where we can explore empathy and what it feels like to walk in someone else's shoes. And so I wanted to write a fictional story of someone who had Alzheimer's and tell it from the very first symptoms, the symptoms we missed in my grandmother by probably a decade because we had assumed that forgetting was a normal part of normal aging. We were in denial. No one wants to see this happen to someone you love. So that was the reason why I changed from doing scientific research to writing fiction. And so in the job of writing that first book and every book that has followed, I need to learn about what it feels like to have it. And I want to tell the truth under the imagined circumstances. So this isn't just like, oh, I wonder what my grandmother was feeling when she had Alzheimer's and when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who she saw and when she forgot I was her granddaughter and couldn't make sense of all of the day-to-day activities that we take for granted because they weren't available to her brain. I didn't just imagine that and write these stories. I did my homework. And the homework began again with every book. It begins with reading. It begins with talking to the medical community. It begins with talking to the scientific community. But then it really involves knowing the patients who have this disease, who are living with it. So with Still Alice as an example, I came to know 27 people living with early stage or early onset Alzheimer's who could still communicate to me what it feels like to have it. And I was in touch with them pretty much every single day for the 1.5 years that I was writing the book. And while the medical information was important and it helped structure the story, the gold was with the people who were living with it. They shared the good, the bad, and the ugly. They were willing to be really vulnerable. And the people who were actually willing to talk to me are the folks who had come to some sort of resilience and an emotional reserve with what they were dealing with, so that they had the resources to be able to raise their hands and say, I'll speak with you, I'll help you. So the people that I tend to meet in doing the research for my books tend to be really inspiring, heroic people who have framed what they're going through in such a way that it doesn't sink them every single day. So while some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, it sounds good in theory to be in touch with patients, but I'm a little scared of that. It's, a little intimidating or overwhelming or frightening what these people are going through, and dark and upsetting and heartbreaking. That stuff, of course, is obvious and it's there, but you'd be surprised what else is there. I've said over and over again, I have learned more about how to live from knowing people who are living with life-threatening illnesses. They've taught me how to live. It's because people going through things like Huntington's or Alzheimer's or ALS, they tend to frame their situation in a way that gets them really present and prioritizes their lives and what they want to pay attention to on what's important. And we who aren't faced with life-threatening illnesses can tend to forget that we're mortal and forget that we may not have tomorrow. And these people help bring me back to reminding me of how to live. And so the research for Still Alice was 27 people living with Alzheimer's. Likewise with each story, when I researched autism, I got to know families living with autism, Huntington's, ALS, which is how I got to know Rob. I'm right now writing a book about ALS, and I am in living rooms and in assisted living centers with folks living with this disease, on email, communicating with people who can only type with their eyes. And I'm learning about what it feels like to have it. And so what does that do for me? It does a few things. It gives my books a real three-dimensional authenticity. I've met other fiction writers who've written about Huntington's, for example. I met one woman who wrote a book that she asked me to read and write a blurb for the cover, those quotes on the cover. And I read it, and it was okay, but it lacked an emotional depth to it. And I actually got on the phone with her and I asked, did you meet anyone with Huntington's while you were doing the research for this book or writing this book? And she said, no. And for me, it feels like a disservice to what I'm trying to do if I didn't actually know people going through this. So breathe three-dimensional life into the story. It adds emotional nuance. You can't understand the day-to-day moments of how does it affect your relationship with your husband, your wife, your kids, your identity. If you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's and you lose your job and you've placed all your value and your worth in your job, who are you now? How do you matter? What are you wrestling with this disease in addition to the medical symptoms? What is it like to live as a human being with this disease? And so that helps inform my story, and that's great because it helps me write a successful book. But beyond that, what it has done for me in terms of, if you ask me who I am and what I do, it's like, well, I'm a neuroscientist, and yes, I'm a novelist, but I'm also an advocate. And that's been a really an unexpected and really awesome surprise that's come out of all of this. I didn't set out to become an Alzheimer's advocate when I wrote Still Alice. I fully accept and embrace this responsibility with every book I write now. But it was as I kept listening to people who are living with Alzheimer's, and I'm learning from them and I'm writing the story, I'm starting to realize that I have both an opportunity and a responsibility to give these folks a face and a voice. That people aren't really talking about people living with Alzheimer's, that the image of that disease is that Alzheimer's is a disease of the dying elderly. And they're in a nursing home and they don't know anyone anymore. And like, you know, we have, of all the things that we can spend money on and focus on, maybe we can ignore that. And unfortunately, that ignores the millions of people who are living with this disease. And so part of what I do is I get out there and I meet the people living with this disease so I can see and hear and feel what it's like. And that gives me tremendous purpose in what I do, both in writing the stories and then advocating for these folks as the book becomes a vehicle for discussion and conversation about what these diseases are, so we can drag them out of the closet and into people's living rooms and movie theaters where you can begin to imagine the full human experience. You know, I was talking to Rob earlier about how this, you know, I'm writing about ALS now and I know all these people who have it, and we just lost someone dear to us who has it, and it gives me a sense of purpose and responsibility to do these people proud, to create something that will be important and represent them and portray everyone's experience well. So for all of you and what you do, so I know, you know, you work for a company and you're developing a drug and it's in, you know, maybe it's ready to go into clinical trials or it's about to do that, and you're thinking about what is the market potential, and you've got Excel spreadsheets and you've got all of these numbers and you're trying to figure out, you know, is this good for your company, and is this going to be successful? And those measurements of success are important for the company you work for. And it's also important for you. I get that you have a career that you care about and you have a livelihood that you care about. You need to earn a living for you and your family, and that matters. And beyond that, I think it's what will be awesome for you, and what has been awesome for me in the true sense of that word, not just from Massachusetts using awesome, is to know people who are living with the diseases that you're working on. So if you're working for a company who's working on a particular cancer, or if it's ALS, or if it's Alzheimer's disease, and you've never met anyone who's living with this, then your motivation and your inspiration day to day might be very sort of in your head, intellectual, or it's like, I'm getting a great paycheck and I love the people I work with and I'm proud of the company I work for, and we're going to do this great thing, and it's going to be successful. And if you meet people who have this, I guarantee you it will change your life. It will instill a sense of purpose in you, that you really get that what you're doing is part of something extraordinary, historic, heroic, that you're not just, fulfilling something that's about a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet, that you're developing drugs that will change lives, that will decrease suffering, that will change the course of disease, that will prolong people's lives, that will save people's lives. And this isn't just like, some people's lives, it's like, 5.4 million Americans have Alzheimer's, and so if we can extend the lives of people with Alzheimer's, that helps, this many millions of people, and that's a number on a piece of paper. If you know people living with Alzheimer's, then I'm helping grandmothers and husbands and teachers and architects, and you can relate as a human being, and you can understand your place and in the changing of how people on this planet are living. It's an extraordinary thing that you're part of. And so to know people who have this I encourage you and I invite you to figure out a way to know some patients who are living with the diseases and disorders that your company or your division are working on. It will plug you in and ignite you in a way that you can't otherwise get. It has been an extraordinary journey for me, one very unexpected. I used to work in a lab with rats and mice and DNA, and now I spend my times in people's living rooms. And I get that there can be the hesitation of like, we hate to be uncomfortable. And if we haven't done this before, it's unfamiliar, and things that are unfamiliar tend to be uncomfortable. Give it a try anyway. Give this to yourself. It will change how you get up in the morning and go to your job. You're part of a team that is in collaboration with these folks, really. You can create a collaboration with the communities who are living with these diseases, and they will be the champions of what you're doing if you let them in on knowing that you're interested and you're curious and you care, and you see that what you're doing here in your companies is for a very human cause. So that's what I continue to do with my books. It has been incredibly rewarding, and I'm very excited to be here today to know that you're all thinking about this as well, that getting involved and understanding the patients that you are researching for can only add to the excitement and the sense of being driven and the sense of purpose that you're all involved in. So thank you very much, and I have a few minutes to answer any questions that you might all have. Thank you. Anyone? Because I'm going to get my car and go after this.
Kate, you want to go first? We'll bring your microphone down.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to have you here, and I know that some of us have books for you to sign, so hopefully you don't scoot out too quickly. I came from a patient advocacy background even before I joined industry, and I think something that would be helpful to us in the room is what are the things that patients want us to know? So when you go into the living rooms, what's the first thing that the patient is saying to you? Thank you for being here. Here's what I want you to know about me. What is the piece about the story that we should carry back about patients?
Oh gosh, it's so different with every person, because you meet people where they are, and some people have just been diagnosed a week ago, some people are about to go into hospice. And so it depends. I think that everyone wants to be seen and heard. So whether you have a disease or not, you don't want to disappear. One of the things that happens to people with disease is they get excluded from community and alienated, isolated. Oftentimes there's shame involved. There are a whole host of reasons why people suddenly feel dropped out, invisible, I don't matter anymore. And so simply by showing up and saying, I just want to meet you, and just tell me anything you want to say. Where are you at with this? What are your, to use some like biotech language, like what are your unmet needs? Like, what's going on with you? What drugs are you on? How are they working for you? How are you feeling with them? What could be better? Like how could your day-to-day life be improved with this? Oftentimes it isn't a drug that they need. It's care. I'd love to go see a Red Sox game, and that's just, I have no idea how I'd ever get there. You develop the relationships that I have with people living with disease. They tend to not be superficial right from start. So, I met a guy with ALS the other day who's has a tracheostomy tube, and he's on a ventilator, life support, and he speaks through eye gaze technology, and he's immediately asking me about, he's like, I know you're divorced. Have you fallen in love again? Are you okay? And so it's like you will, yeah, and same with him. Like he's telling me about his wife, who they still love each other, but they divorced because this is too hard for her. And it's, he's heartbroken, but he forgives her, and they still see each other, and it's hard because now she's dating. And so you will drop into a very authentic relationship really quick, because there's no time for oh, how are you? Good. I'm good. How are you? Good. That's not going to happen. And you'll leave going, wow, I think as human beings, we're meant to connect with each other, like in an open-hearted, vulnerable way. But through our childhoods and growing up, we built all of these really thick walls, and we're like, how are you? Good. How are you? Good. And we keep going. And if you get in front of people living with these diseases, you will hear and experience authentic human connection, and it feels so good. It's not just about, you'll do this for them in some ways. You're like, oh, I'm going to go, and I'm going to like listen to this person, and I'm going to help, I'm going to let them be seen and heard, and I'm going to offer some help or just give them some attention, and you think maybe like this is something that I'm kind of doing for them. At least I do, like I'm going and I'm looking for information, but it's so reciprocal, you don't know where it begins and ends. And so some of my closest friendships have been formed during the research phases for my books. So yeah, they tell you what they're ready to tell you, but they won't hold back. We're the ones who hold back.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What made you do it? Like, how did you have the guts to stop what you were doing and say, write a book? I mean, I say I'm going to write a book once a month. I'm not going to do it.
Oh, you tried to...
Right? I like driving down the road. I want to write a book. And then before you know it, you're taking a turn and you're on to something else.
Yeah, you wanted me to write the book earlier.
We'll talk about that afterwards. But seriously, that's huge. I mean, think of how many people say they want to do that and you did it. What was the aha moment that really made you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a couple things. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I had the naivete to not understand how hard it was to write a book or how hard it would be to get it published. I didn't know. I wasn't a writer, so I wasn't familiar with how doom and gloom that crowd can be. So the space, I had been working at a company called Health Advances. Some of you may know that. I was a strategy consultant and loved that job. Did that for a couple of years, and then my oldest daughter was born, and I quit intending to take a year off because it was just tons of hours in travel, and I wanted to get my little girl started on the planet in a sane way. And then my marriage started to unravel, and I didn't go back to work because I was sort of paralyzed in, I don't want my marriage to fall apart, and I don't know what to do. I was trying to fix it, and then it did fall apart, and we were separated and divorced. So my daughter was 3. I was an unemployed, divorced, single mom who should have gone back to Health Advances or a biotech or like any number of jobs that I was qualified for and would have had health insurance and nice benefits and stability. But in the upheaval of my life, like I was really heartbroken and scared because I'm a scientist. My life had been very carefully planned and plotted, and you could graph the thing. And now I was like, I don't know what my future is going to look like. I don't know what's going to happen. I was really scared. I was crying a lot. And then sort of instead of being scared of not knowing what was going to happen next, thank God something shifted and it became a really exciting curiosity and opportunity. I don't know what's going to happen next. Okay, well, what could happen next? If I could do anything I wanted, and if I didn't have to care what anybody thought of me, that was the biggest that's the best clause. Ask yourself this. If I could do anything I wanted and I didn't have to care what anybody thought of me, what would I do? So, I know you did this. So it's, and the answer the answer I couldn't escape was write the book. And so I didn't go back to work. I began writing Still Alice and all that research I just talked about. And pretty much everyone I knew thought I was nuts. And I couldn't get it published at first. I had to self-publish it and sell it out of the trunk of my car for almost a year before I found Simon & Schuster. And then, it sold. And then Julianne Moore won an Oscar. So, yeah. Kind of worked out. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. How about a big round of applause?
Thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you.